Well, this ended like probably 2 year long or more search for a good fit and the right school to go to, and trying to find a scholarship. That's something he'd always wanted to do, is play ball at the next level, and he's got a lot of talent. And so that's not something that I have a lot of experience with, but I talked to Casey, his dad, our brother-in-law, about it as they would go and just ask him different updates as they visited all kinds of places all over. And I know that one of the, you would think like, what do you look for when you go somewhere? They would see what kind of facilities they have. They would get, they would get a tour. They would find out something about the school, how their practice facilities were, what it looked like, the feeling you get. That was part of it. He didn't mention this, but I assume you'd want to know, do they have a decent team? I think if I was going to play somewhere, I'd want to play for a good team. But the thing that he mentioned, in fact, the one thing that he said is that Casey would tell me that Cade wanted to go somewhere where they would help him develop as a player. It would help him get better. And that's an interesting thing, if you're really into that. If you're a good ball player of any kind, you might have an option of going to a team where you're going to immediately be the best guy on the team, or you're going to get the starting spot, or you're going to be guaranteed you're playing for a team that's got a good chance at winning and having a good record. But how would that compare in your mind to playing for a coach that is going to help you grow and develop and become even better at your sport? Well, depending on who you are, that might be more important than some of those other things. And I think that's a key part of coaching. It's a key part of any kind of leadership. It's a key part of parenting. It's in any way, if we have a position of leadership, we should be interested in developing and coaching and helping the people that are underneath you to grow and develop and get better at what they do. And so applying that to Peter, this morning's lesson was on Peter, and we looked at the role that he played, kind of a special role in the early chapters of Acts. We've been studying through that in a series of sermons. So we looked at Peter and how the Lord used him in an important way. And we see him standing up and addressing crowds. We see him on trial, defending his faith very bravely. We see him facing, the danger of persecution with a lot of courage and conviction. But if you back up and you do one of those kind of behind the scenes, how you got here, we're sort of seeing him now performing on this huge stage in Acts. But if we back up to see how was he prepared for that moment? How was he coached to get him ready when he would have that opportunity to step out in front of a crowd of thousands of people and address them, or to stand there on trial for, and possibly face the risk of beatings, imprisonment, maybe even death. And so for that, we're going to go back now this morning to look at some examples through the Gospels of how Peter was coached, let's say, to borrow that terminology. We're going to look at 4 examples that are all going to be on the lake. So if you're a lake person, you'll enjoy this lesson. They're all going to be on the Sea of Galilee. So we'll look at 4 events from the life of Peter. We could pick a lot more, but I'm just going to pick these 4, and that's what they have in common. And they're kind of key moments as Jesus took him from being just a fisherman and brought him to that moment when he was ready to step out and become an apostle. So the first one's going to be in Luke chapter 5, and it's when Peter was first called. I'm going to have to move through these fairly quickly just for the sake of time. They're familiar accounts, and I trust that you're familiar with the basic story. So in this, it appears, if you go to John's gospel, that probably Peter and John had already met Jesus, but they had not yet been called to follow him. So at this point, they're there working, and Jesus comes along, and a crowd has gathered. Verse 1 of Luke chapter 5. On one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret. That's also the Sea of Galilee. And he saw 2 boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. So I learned a little bit about fishing in that day. Apparently, it was common that they would fish during the night. Maybe it was better fishing to fish at night. There's a couple of reasons for that. The way the fish, their behavior made it more likely to have a good catch at night. But also because they couldn't put them on ice. They didn't have refrigeration. So they would take the haul of the night's catch and they would take them directly into the market, and they could sell them the next day. And, that was kind of their pattern. So we noticed this, that they fished at night. And they were not part of this crowd that had assembled. They had been working, and now they're there cleaning the nets. So verse 3 says, getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land, and he sat down and taught the people from the boat. So initially, Peter, if you got the picture, he's there just kind of washing his net. these crowds are all there. Jesus is there, and Jesus turns around. There's a boat. He gets in. He says, hey, can we, let's use your boat to kind of get a little space here so he can address the people. So Peter stops his mending and washing of nets to just sort of, maneuver the boat out a little bit from land so that Jesus could use it as a floating pulpit. So far, that was all that Peter was, that was his involvement. But then Jesus says in verse 4, when he had finished speaking, so Peter had a, front row seat for this whole sermon, he said to Simon, of course, that's Peter, of course, put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. We can be sure that Peter didn't see this coming. And imagine what might be going through his mind. They had just fished all night. They caught nothing. From what I read, they fished mostly close to the shore. But Jesus is saying, put out into the deep. They'd already washed the nets. So this seems to be, from what little I understand about the wrong time of day, the wrong method. There's, they've already been fishing. There's no fish. And not only that, but there's thousands of people on the shore watching. And Jesus says to him, hey, put the nets in the water. And Jesus is a carpenter, and Peter's a professional fisherman. So what you might think was going through his mind, well, whatever he was thinking, he says in verse 5, Master, we toiled all night and took nothing. I guess he felt obligated to give that, caution. But then he says, but at your word, I will let down the nets. That's a great picture of faith. Faith obeys, even when maybe it doesn't make sense, even when we don't understand, even when that's not what we would normally do. If that's what the Lord says and we obey, that's a great picture of faith. And the result, of course, verse 6, when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish. Their nets were breaking. They signaled to the partners in the other boat to come help them. And they came and filled the boats so that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. Peter just realized at that moment that he was not worthy to be in the presence of this other man who was in the boat with him. He said, he couldn't get away. They're in the boat, but he suddenly just he's like, I'm not worthy to be in your presence, because he recognized the power of Jesus. Now, did Jesus know that Peter was a sinful man before all this? Of course he did. But it says, verse 9, he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. So also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men. So as we look at these, each of these accounts, I want us to think, how is Jesus coaching Peter in this case? And then I want us to realize that Jesus wants to coach each of us. He wants to develop you, and he wants to develop me. And so where are we kind of in this growth process? So in this first step, Peter wasn't yet a follower. He wasn't yet a disciple. He was a fisherman, and he had the opportunity to sit and listen to Jesus. He almost had no choice because he was sitting in the boat with him while Jesus is preaching. But he had the front row seat there to listen. But then he received an instruction, and he chose to obey, even though I'm sure it went against his better judgment and what he thought was going to be successful. He did what Jesus said. And then we see the result of that, and he suddenly humbled himself and recognized the power of Jesus. And Jesus, I'm sure, understood that Peter was a sinful man. He was not a flawless human being, but he chose him to work with. He said, I'm going to make you a fisher of men. This was step number one in that journey. Let's go to Mark chapter 4 for the next event in the boat. A little time has passed. Other events have happened, miracles, teachings. But another occasion on the lake. Verse 35. On that day when evening had come, he said to them, let us go across to the other side. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat just as he was. The other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he, that is Jesus, of course, was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing? And he woke, rebuked the wind and the sea, and said to the sea, Peace, be still. The wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great fear, and they said to one another, Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? So just as God did with his people of Israel, when he called them out, he describes it in Hosea as he took them by the hands and led them out as your father would lead a child, from the land of Egypt. And then he let them be tested. He let them face things, difficulties. And what he was hoping they would do is grow in their faith through those trials. And the same thing is happening here with the disciples. They're in the boat with Jesus. A great storm is coming. Water's crashing in. Jesus is sound asleep. And they panic. And Jesus uses this as a teaching opportunity. He first calms the storm. And then he says, why are you so afraid? And it says in verse 41, they were filled with great fear. There's two kinds of fear demonstrated here. One, they started out just being afraid of nature, afraid of their surroundings, afraid of the storm and the winds and the water. But by the time it was over, their fear had been reoriented, and they had a fear of God, a fear of the power, a healthy, I would say, kind of fear. And what Jesus was teaching them in this moment is that you can trust God, and you can have faith even in frightening times, even in times that seem dangerous, even when there's storms are rocking your world. You can still grow and have faith in God and trust in him, because it's better to fear the Creator than to fear his creation. The things that we encounter in this world that are just, part of this life are just like that storm. But God is more powerful than all those things. And so we can hold on to our faith and trust in him during those times when everything seems to be going crazy. And so you can imagine that, just think about how this would help them later in life as they learn, okay, when I face these moments, I can hold on to my faith. I can trust in God. Even when it looks like the situation is dire, I don't have to be afraid of all that. I can keep my faith in the Lord. So if we can imagine Peter's faith here from the time he was a fisherman, when he saw that catch a fish and Jesus said, follow me, he's been coached now a little bit. His faith, I'm sure, is growing. We come to another occasion on the boat in Matthew 14, where we see Peter really start to put his faith into action. You can tell that his faith is growing. In Matthew 14, another crossing of the sea, verse 22, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. They said, it's a ghost. And they cried out in fear. And immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Do you see his faith growing? This is. I'm sure he's got a lot more faith now. He's been with Jesus. He's been through some things with Jesus. He's seen some things. He knows Jesus has power. And he's starting to connect what Jesus can do and what he can do. But he doesn't want to act without a word from the Lord. And he says, at your command, I will step out. And he wants to exercise his faith, which is wonderful. Jesus invites him. In verse 29, he said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. Have you ever thought about it? There were two people in the world who walked on water. Jesus and Peter. Everybody else in the boat could have got out, don't you think? Think about that. Could everybody have said, me too, Lord? They could have all been, all 12 or 13 of them could have been out there walking around experiencing this miracle. But Peter had the faith, and he asked, and Jesus invited him, and he stepped out, and he started to walk on water. But we know in verse 30, when he saw the wind, he was afraid. He began to sink, and he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Those in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. Even though we might say his faith seemed to be bigger than the other people's faith, Jesus said it's still small. He's still got a lot of grace to grow. He's still got a lot of growing to do. He had taken a step by faith. He took a few steps, and then he started to sink. So it's like, to me, it's reminiscent of a little child who's just learning to walk, and they finally, they let go of the table and, they take a couple of steps. And that's, I think we see Peter's faith kind of in this point of development here. It's really encouraging to see. But Jesus says you can do a lot more than that. You can continue to grow in your faith. What do you think he learned from this experience? Well, for one thing, we see their faith is growing in him. Is now they're saying he's the Son of God. That's a amazing confession. This is, if you remember this morning's lesson, we're just around the corner from when he's going to say, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," and be blessed for that. It was moments like this that I'm sure through God brought him to that conviction. I think he realized that if he was going to follow Jesus, if he was going to step out in faith, he needed to be focused on Jesus. Most people pointed out that as he says he saw the wind. Well, if he was looking at the wind and looking at everything around him, he probably was not focused on Jesus, who was giving him the power to do this. If we're going to step out in faith, if we're going to exercise that faith, we're going to have to remain focused on the one who is empowering us. And then, of course, if we step out in faith, there's going to be noise. There's going to be winds. There's going to be stuff around us that's going to want to distract us. And that could happen, and that we should prepare for that and be ready for that. It means we have to, if we're going to walk by faith, we have to remain focused on the Lord. But I think he probably learned as well the Lord's got his back, don't you think? When he started to sink, he cried out. Immediately, Jesus has his hand, lifted him up back in the boat. You know, there would be occasions after this where Peter would be on trial and he would face, frightening situations. But I'm sure he remembered that the Lord's got his back. The Lord's with him, and he's going to be there even when Peter might feel like his faith is weak. Okay, the last one is in John 21. John 21. On the Sea of Galilee again. Oh, but a lot has changed as we move from one of these to the next. Jesus has been crucified between that last one and this one. Between the last time and this time, Jesus had a conversation with the disciples. He said, "You will all fall away from me." And Peter said, "Not me. Even though they all fall away, I will never fall away." Jesus said, "I tell you, this night you will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows." And he did. He tried to stick to his word. He followed Jesus. He came into that inner court where the soldiers were warming themselves by a fire. Before the night was over, he was swearing and cursing and saying that he didn't know Jesus. And then he looked and they made eye contact and he remembered what Jesus had said and he went out and wept bitterly. He had come so far in his faith. He felt strong in his faith. He felt like he could face anything. But Jesus said that Satan had demanded to sift him like wheat. He was going to be put to an extreme test. And he failed that test. He collapsed. He failed in a very public way and really, I'm sure, let himself down and felt like he had let his Lord down by denying in the presence of witnesses that he even knew who Jesus was. And it had to completely turn his world upside down. Think about his confidence in himself, his confidence in his ability to do this thing that Jesus had called him to do, to be a fisher of men. Was he up to the task? Could he really do this? Had he been just foolish all along to think that he could do this job? When as soon as the Lord is, he's put on trial, he fails the test and denies that he knows him. Is he going to even be able to be an apostle? I think we see all those questions kind of resolved in this occasion. So, of course, Jesus had rose from the dead, and he had told the ladies who came to the tomb to tell the disciples to go to Galilee, and he would see them there. And he has appeared to them a couple of times before this, but this is the third time. In chapter 21, let's start in verse 1. After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, 2 others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." So they went out and got in the boat, but that night they caught nothing, another all night long fruitless fishing expedition. Just as day was breaking, verse 4 says, Jesus stood on the shore. The disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, "Children, do you have any fish?" They answered him, "No." And he said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. The disciple whom Jesus loved, therefore, said to Peter, "It is the Lord." He said, "We've seen this before." This must have been one of those, what we call deja vu, right? Like this is all too familiar. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. The other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. They were not far from land, about 100 yards off. I think it's a beautiful scene. John puts the two and two together first. He says, that's the Lord. When it dawned on Peter who it was, he just throws himself into the water. In the very first scene, when this happened, he said, Lord, get away from me. I'm a sinful man. 2 times later, he was stepping out of the boat in fear. This time he's diving in and swimming for all he's worth. To come see his Lord, to go see Jesus on the shore. Verse 9 says, when they got to land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out on it and bread. So Jesus had prepared them a breakfast. And we skip down to verse 15. When they had finished speaking, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, feed my lambs. He said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, tend my sheep. And he said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. It's interesting that Jesus gives him 3 opportunities to affirm his love for him. The parallel there to the 3 times that he denied him seems inescapable. 3 times Peter said, I don't even know him. And Jesus now asks him and gives him 3 times in the presence of witnesses to declare that he loves him. And Peter does. And Jesus also, not only that, 3 times affirms that he has a job for Peter. He still has work for Peter to do. Feed my sheep, tend my sheep, take care of my lambs. He has a role for Peter. He's not done with him. Think of how, imagine if, I don't know, it's almost silly to compare sports or anything to that, but somebody has failed in the biggest possible way. And yet the person, their coach, the person they look up to and admire, the one they know they've let down, the one they know they've disappointed, is coming to them and saying, hey, I've still, you got to go back in. We've got another game to play. We've got more. I need you. I've got a role for you. He's not kicked off the team. He's not fired. He's still needed. Yes, he failed. He's forgiven. And now he has opportunity to continue to serve because the job is not done. And then finally, he reveals to him that he would have to give his life in this service. Verse 18, truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. When you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. After saying this, he said to him, follow me. Whether Peter understood all that or not, I don't know. But Jesus was revealing that in the end, there's going to come a time when people are going to take him and lead him. That's what had happened to Jesus. The same thing is going to happen to Peter. But he still says, follow me. So at the conclusion of this, Jesus is going to ascend into heaven, and he's going to wait in Jerusalem for the Holy Spirit, and then he is ready to step out in front of a crowd of thousands of people and preach to them the message of the gospel. And he's ready to stand on trial and be threatened and have his life threatened and say, we must obey God rather than men. And so I think we can see how Jesus has developed him. And even along the course of that journey, it involved a very painful failure. And yet the Lord forgave him, picked him up, continued to encourage him, and reaffirmed his status as a servant, and that he still had a job for Peter to do. And so I think it's just a beautiful example of how the Lord coached him and how he will work with us as well. So these 6 points came to my mind as I was kind of just thinking back through it. Back to the first boat, when Jesus gave Peter, when he didn't even really know him all that well, some instructions to cast out. It probably didn't make a lot of sense, but Peter said, at your word, I will do it. You might be at this step, which is, I don't really know the Lord that well, but I'm interested in following him. And it begins by having the faith that says, I will trust and I will do what he says. That's the first step of faith. Okay, I'm going to obey him. I'm going to try things his way. I'm going to do what he says. When we put our faith in him, we begin this journey. Then it wasn't long that they started to see danger around them, and even in this storm. And he learned through that the Lord had power over all that, and he could trust God even when the life seemed to be rocking and rolling and turning upside down. And maybe you're at that stage. Maybe your world's being turned upside down by some storm. You also can grow through that. We know that through our trials, our faith grows and becomes stronger. And it may be the Lord is allowing you an opportunity to face something dangerous so that he can develop you and develop your faith and make you stronger than you were before. And then there comes a day when it's time to step out in faith and put our faith into action and to say, I want to follow the Lord. I want to do what he says. And if we do that, we should be ready for the fact that there's going to be distractions, there's going to be noise, there's going to be wind, but we're going to have to remain focused on Jesus. And if I thought I first read that when, I don't know what's the better word, when you fall, if you fall. As Peter started to sink, he called out to Jesus, and Jesus reached his hand. And then later, when he failed in the most public, awful, painful way, when he saw the Lord, he dove in and swam to him. And what did he find? Jesus' love and mercy and forgiveness. And so no matter how bad you blow it, no matter how bad you mess up, no matter how spectacular you go down in flames, and so, on the biggest possible moment, and you just completely wreck it, the Lord still has a job for you. He's still got a role for you in his plan. He will forgive you, and he will put you to work. And then as he reaffirmed to him, do you love me? Every time he asked him that, he gave him a job, or he told him, I have work for you to do. Feed my sheep, tend my sheep. So if we love the Lord, we're going to have to be busy about his business. And then he ends it by saying, this is going to go down a deadly path for you, in not so many words, but you still need to follow me. We have to be committed to follow him even unto death, if that be what is called of us. And that's the level of faith that's required. Once we realize there's nothing in this life to be afraid of, we're going to follow the Lord. What can man do to me? What's the worst that can happen? We're all going to die. The question is, where are you going to go after that? And so if you follow the Lord, then he will be there to welcome you home when this is all over. If there's someone here this morning who needs to give your life to the Lord, or if you need to ask for the prayers of the church, if there's any way that we can help, we would certainly be glad to.